Hey there, Homo sapiens. Welcome to Anthropology for Homo sapiens. I'm your host, Adriana, and today we're going to talk about contradictions. So this episode is actually a project for one of my courses that I'm doing for my master's degree. And I'll probably do a lot more episodes about my own research, but today we're just kind of going to focus on some of the fundamental issues that inspired the project I'm doing for my master's degree. But I said we're going to talk about contradictions. And where better to find contradictions than in the Western understanding of mental health. I'm sure many of you can relate to scrolling through your Instagram or TikTok or Pinterest feeds and being swamped with contradictory advice about mental well-being. Generally, all the advice seems fairly common sense, but then you start to realize that each new piece contradicts the last. I know I find it overwhelming to see all this contradictory advice, even though I know they are meant to be strong statements applied situationally and with more nuance than is explicitly stated. While these contradictions concern me, there's a deeper contradiction in the North American understanding of mental health that I find concerning as both a researcher and as an advocate. So, first of all, mental health should be considered a health issue. And specifically a public health issue, which I'll speak to a bit later. But concerning health, your mental health affects your entire body. So not just what we think of as emotions or behaviors, mood, that sort of thing, but also affects sort of your physical health as well. So, for example, depression can cause fatigue. It can also prevent women from getting their periods. And sort of more indirectly, depression can cause poor hygiene and less activity, physical activity. And so these things can sort of indirectly then lead to poor physical health. And this is just one example among many, many others. Nonetheless, there's something deeply troubling about requiring people to legitimize their suffering biomedically, to sort of pathologize, or in other words, treat as abnormal or unhealthy aspects of their identities. This is especially clear when we think about how diverse experiences of mental unwellness are, and how they can be affected by not only someone's biology or their physical environment, but also their social environment, the culture within which they find themselves, their socioeconomic status, and a whole host of other intersectional aspects of an individual's identity. So, how do we deal with these contradictions? And what does it mean to have something be a matter of health, but be problematic to always or entirely be medicalized? Let's start this conversation by asking ourselves how we define health. The World Health Organization defines health as a complete state of holistic well-being, including not only the absence of biological pathology, but also social and mental wellness. Specifically, they define mental health as a state of well-being in which every individual realizes their own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to their community. On one hand, these definitions severely limit who we consider healthy. They suggest that anyone with a disability or chronic illness cannot be healthy, as health is a totalizing state, since a lot of mental unwellness occurs in an oscillating fashion. In other words, it comes and goes. It's not steady, but changes over time, with some periods being better than others. We need to critically examine what our definitions of health actually mean for people's daily lives. Nonetheless, the WHO definitions do something important. They suggest that health is not merely medical. Here, I'm going to posit my own somewhat simplified definition of health. I think health is a state of satisfying daily existence which need not be normalized. If you are comfortable and content, I think we can consider you healthy. But I also think that, like most things, we should consider health on a spectrum. At the extreme ends, we have total health and total disease, but day by day, how well or ill you feel will change and won't necessarily reach an extreme at either end. The point here is that health, unlike pathology, is subjective. It captures how you actually experience your existence. So while you might have an identifiable pathology or predisposing factor that could be found by a doctor, you might feel perfectly well and healthy. On the other hand, you might not have a pathology that could be identified by someone in the medical profession and yet still be really struggling or feel ill. And this is what happens a lot of the time with mental illness. It's also important in this regard to note that people might have their own goals for recovery that don't necessarily line up with the so-called objective goals of the medical profession, which is usually to completely remove a disorder. For example, while I find panic attacks and overwhelming embarrassment to be not fun, an aspect of suffering, my anxiety in other ways can be really helpful when I think about it in certain ways. So it can tell me what's important and can motivate me to do really good work. Additionally, mental unwellness can act kind of in the same way as a physical injury. So a physical injury, the physical pain from that will tell you where in your body that injury is. And then you know to kind of be gentle with that part of your body so that you don't cause it further injury, and then allow it to sort of heal and rest, and then that will make it get better faster. And the same thing sort of goes for mental unwellness. So it can actually sort of inform you where in your life you might need to make some changes, or sort of what's causing these conditions. And so sometimes those things are going to be things that we can control. So for example, if living in the city is really bothering you because of all the smog or the noise kind of has you on alert all the time, and that's not good for your mental health, you can move away from the city. Or, you know, you might be in a toxic relationship and that's causing problems with your mental health, you can end that relationship. On the other hand, there are also going to be factors that aren't going to be under our individual control. So things like poverty and discrimination. But it's still important for us to be able to identify those things as causing mental unwellness in people's lives, because then we can sort of go in and advocate for change. It also shows us that clearly some of these problems with mental unwellness are caused by social and political factors, and so it's not all medical. So this brings us to the identity part of our discussion, and something that I find helpful to start with is Parsons' conception of the sick role. In his 1951 book, The Social System, Talcott Parsons discusses people's social roles and how these fit into society. For example, being a student or a teacher or a parent or a doctor comes with certain expectations and responsibilities. Parsons also put forward the idea that when you are sick, you occupy a different social role than the one you would normally fill, and this is called the sick role. The sick role is a social role that must be legitimized by a biomedical authority, such as a medical doctor or a psychiatrist, and is shaped by the societal expectation that the person has a desire to recover and is exempt from normal social role activities as competent help is sought, usually from a doctor or a psychiatrist. While the sick role is an option that many people adopt in order to legitimize their struggles with mental health, for example by getting a medical diagnosis, it's not a role that everyone feels comfortable to adopt. People may worry about stigma from others. They may not view themselves as ill, or they may simply wish to avoid being labeled as such. Once a sick role is adopted, people's self-perceptions, as well as the perception of them by others, and by society at large, can sort of orient their identity towards that of the psychiatric patient or towards a specific diagnostic label. And this diagnostic label is sort of assumed to explain everything about that person. Now, while diagnostic labels are helpful for some people because they help them sort of conceptualize and legitimate their struggles, both to themselves, to medical professionals, as well as to family and friends. For others, or sometimes simultaneously, because we can never forget the complex and nuanced nature of human beings, these labels become a box from which people struggle to escape. not only does it align their identity with the idea of a negative disease state or pathology, but it also obliges them to carry the social and moral overtones, the stigma, that is often associated with a psychiatric diagnosis. Their deficits are assumed and emphasized, and the capabilities they gain or retain are downplayed. By medicalizing these issues, we as a society are able to stay ignorant of some of those social issues I mentioned earlier, which are implicated in mental unwellness, because we can assume a biological origin for people's studies. That's sort of what happens when things get associated with biomedicine. But speaking of us as a society, while mental health might seem like something very private, I would argue it's actually a very public experience. I say this not only because of many of the causes and effects of mental unwellness in a single individual arise during their interactions with others and with social systems, so for example, struggles in school or with the healthcare system as they work through another health problem, but also because mental unwellness of one person has ripple effects throughout entire communities. And these communities can also serve as vital resources for the recovery and for resilience in the face of mental health. The dictionary definition of public health is the art and science dealing with the protection and improvement of community health by organized community effort and including preventative medicine and sanitary and social science. I find this definition really interesting and useful because it is holistic in nature. It recognizes that health is something we can understand and promote not only with biomedical science, but also with social science, and that healthcare can be, and I'd argue should be, an art. And it also focuses on preventative measures, meaning we don't have to be ill in order to think about health. Critically, though, it outlines this idea that community health must be improved by an organized effort by the community as a whole. I think if we've learned anything from the COVID-19 pandemic, it is this idea that health is not individual. One's health can be affected by the choices made at many levels of community, from the choices your neighbors make regarding wearing a mask or social distancing, to decisions made at the level of the nation state, so the policies your government imposes, for example. And I would argue we can extend this thinking to matters of mental health. Many public health and mental health scholars and advocates have made similar claims. It is not unusual to hear the state of mental wellness on First Nations reserves in Canada or even among students on university campuses called like a public health crisis or emergency. In the end, while health, and specifically mental health, is a subjective experience, it's also public and communal. And it's public and communal in the sense that our own personal health influences the overall health of communities, and as well by vice versa, the overall health of communities, that affects our own personal health. Therefore, when we consider how to heal mental unwellness, we need to consider not only the aspects that can be medicalized, but also how the community will react and influences these methods and understandings. In the end, it is important that we understand the experiences of health as subjective and is influenced not only by biology, but also by sociological and psychological factors. We need to avoid associating abnormality or difference with pathology or illness, and instead focus on suffering and resilience. I hope you found today's discussion interesting. As always, put any questions in the comments or send me an email, and don't forget to subscribe. As Ruth Benedict would say, let's go make the world safe for human differences.